So mythology, yeah. So myths and legends can often be as powerful as the creatures and events that are described within. They're often steeped in symbolism and analogies. Some of them have religious ties, and most of them will have a moral of some kind. Some of them have evolved to either scare or bribe small children into complying with the rules. Now, perhaps these days, myths and legends haven't got quite as much impact in themselves, but often their themes and ideals, things like good and evil, the light against the darkness, or a hero on their quest, is perhaps something that is kind of so universal that they stand in pretty much any story you'd like to think about. Perhaps an example of this transfer of ideals is The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Now, I read this over the summer and didn't really get along with it. I found it quite kind of stodgy, a bit of a chore to read. And don't anyone accuse me of sucking at reading, because I read the entirety of Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Brilliant, I recommend it. But anyway, now, while I didn't get along with Lord of the Rings, I can't help but respect the world he's created. It's quite an impressive feat to build a world with multiple regions and races and such like. And you definitely cannot deny its influence, given Tolkien has basically defined the fantasy genre. The whole Middle Ages, elves, dwarves, and wizards thing is pretty much all down to him. So you have things like the Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, really good book series, and then video game series like The Elder Scrolls, all can trace their roots back to The Lord of the Rings. Now, well, ideals are one thing, but often a good way to kind of take inspiration from this is to take the constructs from the legends itself, say a creature. Now, the way I see it, there are two main ways one can do this. One can take the creature, their established habits and traits, and implant that into your story's world. Or one can take the creature, focus on that, and deconstruct it to its bare basics and build a new world around it. So something that does both of these things quite well actually, is the video game Dragon's Dogma. Now this game will have you fight, so in terms of implanting creatures, you have to fight, among other things, griffins, ogres, cyclopses, golems, chimera, cockatrices, goblins, harpies, and the dragon of the title, obviously. And what the game does well here is it will weave elements of the mythology into gameplay. Now, Dragon's Dogma has kind of two main classes of melee weapons. There are the bladed weapons, the sharp weapons like swords, and there are blunt weapons like maces. So if we take the example of a Hydra, which you can fight in the game, and the Golem. Now, the Golem is a humanoid lump of rock powered by magic. In the game, it is powered by these magic medallions across its surface. Now, being rock, a sword just won't cut it, if you'll excuse the pun. What you have to do is use blunt weapons to break them. So how this translates into gameplay is simply the Golem will resist the bladed weapons and is weak to the blunt weapons. Conversely, you have the Hydra, an enormous multi-headed snake. Now, traditional mythology has when you cut Hydra's head off, it will grow two back in its place. Now, Dragon's Dogma doesn't quite go to that level. I suspect going from 4 heads to 5 heads and so on is probably quite difficult to program. So the Hydra in Dragon's Dogma simply regenerates its head. But logically, you can't cut something with a blunt weapon. It just doesn't work. So the Hydra, unlike the Golem, resists blunt weapons and is weak to the bladed stuff. Now, in terms of deconstructing a creature and building a mythology around it, we take the dragon antagonist of the title. Now, instead of being the cave-dwelling, treasure-hoarding misery guts that tradition has the dragon being, the dragon is reformed as an emissary of a being called the Seneschal, the keeper of the world. This being sends forth the dragon to select a member of humanity with the willpower to take their place. This is how the world works. It's a cycle. So the dragon goes forth, selects a human, who basically starts tearing the place up, and the first human to challenge, to make a real challenge to it, is the one selected. Now, the way selection works is a bit grim, because the dragon basically steals your heart, and then says, come and get me. So you go through the game, having had your heart stolen by the dragon, and the protagonist currently thinking, right, we'll get the heart back. When you actually go to fight the dragon and defeat it, that's when the Seneschal reveals the plan. That's when the path to the Seneschal and the real nature of the world is revealed. So the Seneschal presents you with two options. When you go and challenge him, you fight him and win and take his place, or lose and die, and the Seneschal shall forge your body into the next dragon to find another contender. So this kind of this is an excellent example of how you can rework mythology into your new world. Now, I tried a little bit, dabbled in a bit of story writing, and my idea was, I was thinking about your standard fantasy setting, if there is such a thing, given that fantasy can be anything you think of. The standard fantasy setting of the elves, dwarves, wizards, etc. I was thinking to myself, why is it always sword and sorcery? Why couldn't you give an elf an assault rifle? And that was the basis of my world, a kind of fusion of fantasy combined with this modern sci-fi edge. A world where magic can raise a legion of the undead, and where a way to end a siege could be with a tactical bombing strike from aircraft. Now, this was kind of done with a short story form in a little forum I had with my mates where we'd write short stories, kind of compare them with each other, give feedback, that kind of thing. I felt that when I'm looking back on it, I feel that the scope of this was quite narrow. There's so much, given the ideas I had in my head, I could have done so much more. I could have explored the factionalism between various races. I could have set up epic battle sequences. I could have focused on, could have explored maybe the fusion of magic and technology. Or maybe I could have kept the focus tight on a small group as they, maybe part of a faction, as they play through a kind of epic struggle between multiple factions. So what I guess this comes down to is, what these examples I'm showing, is that from this same inspiration, from this one starting point, the imagination can create a plethora of ideas, a huge variety. It's a bit like humanity, really. We're all built from basically the same stuff, and yet there's an enormous variety between us. So if you think about the number of books there are on a shelf, you can think about how they may have kind of common themes, common imagery, symbolism, that kind of thing. And yet they also have so many different stories, so many different ways of telling it. It's kind of a beautiful thing when you think about it. And when you compare it to other things where, again, you have a simple starting point, exploding into so much variety, it creates this incredible world that we actually live in, and not just an incredible story world. So maybe something to think about when you next have a look in the bookshop or the DVD rack at Tesco's. Thank you.